So the other week I had someone give me a call and they asked, Tom, we've got this piece of machinery coming from outside of the EU. It's supposedly CE marked. We're receiving it into the UK and we're going to be using it for our own use. So the question there is around, or the question they had was around, what do you do with authorised representatives, because they are a requirement in the EU? Are they a requirement in the UK? So what I'm going to do is just unpack that a little bit, and going to look at some of the Department for Trade and Business, or Business and Trade policy, and also have a look at some EU legislation as well. So this was a relatively recent document published. I think it was January this year. So this was an update providing some clarity about UKCA marking and EU product markings. So we're talking primarily here about machinery and CE marking, or UKCA, if we want to kind of hold on to that term. So placing products on the market in Great Britain using UK or EU product markings. And if we just jump down to the introduction, I'm just going to flick through this. So the government intends to lay legislation in spring 2024, which it did, to enable businesses to continue to place CE marked products on the market in Great Britain for a range of goods. So this applies to machinery, this applies to equipment which would fall under the low voltage directive. The government also intends to introduce a range of other measures which are set out in this document. So we've got this continued recognition of EU requirements. So the government will indefinitely recognise current EU requirements, so CE marking, for 21 product regulations. So this certainly includes the Machinery Directive and the Low Voltage Directive, which covers a lot of machinery in the UK. The regulations, or there are other regulations that fall into that as well, so things like the Pressure Equipment Directive as well, and EMC. But they are listed in Annex A of this document if you want to check out those. So businesses can also continue to use the UKCA marks to place relevant products on the GB market. This means businesses will have the flexibility to either use the CE marking or UKCA marking. I don't know why you would use the UKCA marking, but hey. So what do I need to do to make use of the continued recognition? So if a business chooses to use the recognised EU requirements to place a product on the GB market, they will need to ensure they have undertaken all the necessary conformity processes, which we're aware of within CE marking. This includes the use of an EU notified body where required, and applying the relevant EU conformity markings, so CE marking. Additionally, the business must provide a declaration of conformity that's been translated into English. Yeah, most of them are English anyway. And lists all the relevant EU product regulations have been met, so there's nothing different here. The one that I want to touch on, though, is item 5. So if you are placing a product on the GB market from outside the UK, you will still need to take action to ensure you comply with importer responsibilities. So this is where it's subtly different to some of the requirements in the EU. The EU stipulate the need for an authorised representative, whereas in the UK, we have roles and responsibilities for importers. So if we just have a quick look at what the EU stipulate. So here's a guidance document for economic operators, market surveillance authorities on the practical implementation of Article 4 of the regulation on market surveillance and compliance of products. So this covers authorised representatives. So what have we got? There's a helpful chart just down here, which I'm going to run through. So the economic operator referred to in Article 4 of the legislation cited. So what does it look like to have an economic operator? So if you have an authorised representative appointed for the tasks of Article 4, if the answer to that is yes, you've got an authorised representative who is situated within that economic locality physically, then that meets the requirements. If we don't, is the product from an EU manufacturer? Yes. Okay, well, we've got an EU manufacturer, there's an EU address on there, they're going to take responsibility, they're going to play the role of the economic operator in Article 4. But if not, if it's sold in bricks and mortar shops in the EU, there's an importer, so they're identified as the economic operator. If not, is it sold via distance sales but with an importer? If it's got an importer, great, there's your economic operator. But if it's not, if it's handled by a fulfillment service provided handled by a fulfillment service provider in the EU, yes, well, the fulfillment service meets those requirements. If that isn't the case, so if something is being sold into the EU, it is being shipped from, say, the UK, then, and they don't have any of these individuals, then what happens? So offering for sale of the product to the EU end users is not allowed until an importer, authorised representative, or fulfillment service provider in the EU is arranged for. So that's the requirement. So there are services that provide authorised representatives or authorised representative services that can fulfill that if you're selling from the UK into the EU. But what if someone is selling from the EU or from outside of the EU into the UK? This doesn't apply, but the question is, what does? So if we go back to our first piece of documentation from the UK government, what do I need to do to make use of continued recognition? Well, down here, there's a link to importer responsibilities. So what is an importer and what are their responsibilities? So if you're an importer is any individual or business established in the UK who supplies a product from outside the UK for distribution, consumption, or use on the GB market in the course of commercial activity. So what does that mean? Who is that? So certainly if you're purchasing something, if you're a reseller, if you're importing, if you're then distributing, you're going to be an importer. But the other one here is that if this is for consumption or use, so potentially someone is going to buy something as the end user, they actually fulfill the criteria for the importer. So what responsibilities are they taking on as the importer? So as well as ensuring the manufacturer has fulfilled their responsibilities, importers have other obligations. Importers should check the relevant product-specific legislation applicable to their product to understand their full responsibilities. And what are their obligations? As an importer, you have legal obligations which go beyond those of distributors. When placing a product on the GB market, before placing the products in the scope of this guidance on the market, the importer must indicate their details on the product, such as their name, registered trademark or trade name, postal address. Well, this is not possible, so they give you a provision here for sticking it on the packaging. And further down, importers must not place a non-compliant product on the GB market. So they have to ensure that the product is compliant. The question is, how do you do that? They must ensure that the manufacturer has carried out the correct conformity assessment procedures, drawn up the relevant technical documentation and instructions for use in English, affixed the relevant conformity markings, and fulfilled their identification obligations. And then there's further information for where, kind of what that looks like, how that's fulfilled in some of these links here. If an importer considers that the product they have supplied is non-compliant, then the importer must take the necessary corrective actions. For example, taking action to ensure the product is compliant, or withdrawing or recalling products from the market. So the importer holds some responsibility, or really significant responsibility, for the compliance of the product. The question is the importer in a position where they can identify compliance, where they know what it is, and where they can kind of rectify non-conformity to said legislation? So I hope that's provided some clarity on the roles of importers in the UK and the roles of authorised representatives in the EU.